The Dead Sea Scrolls. The ruins of the settlement of Hurbat Qumran stand on a cliff, a mile away from the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, in the Jordan Valley. It is there, just south of Jericho, and 20 miles east of Jerusalem, that one of the most important archaeological discoveries in religious history was made. Early in 1947, 3 Bedouin shepherds from the Tamare tribe had their flock in the area, and while Juma Muhammad was looking for a stray goat, he discovered a cave in the cliffs. He threw a rock into the hole, and heard the sound of breaking pottery. 2 days later, his cousin, Muhammad Ahmed al-Hamed, returned and crawled into the small cave, which measured 6 feet by 20 feet. The cave contained many earthenware jars, about 2 feet high and 10 inches wide. Though many were broken, 9 were believed to be intact. Inside one of the jars, he discovered 3 leather rolls wrapped in linen. In a subsequent visit, 4 more leather rolls were discovered. These rolls turned out to be ancient scrolls, which have been referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. A Christian shopkeeper, Khalil Iskander Shaheen, known as Kondo, and Georgi Shaya, Isaiah, Shamoun, members of the Syrian Jacobite Church in Jerusalem, heard about the discovery and went to Qumran to verify the Bedouins' claims, finding some scroll fragments. They later met with the 3 shepherds to examine their findings. One of the Bedouins sold 3 of the scrolls to the Muslim Sheikh of Bethlehem, and Kondo purchased the other 4, which consisted of a 22-foot-long scroll containing the entire text of the Book of Isaiah, the Genesis Apocryphon, the Habakkuk Commentary, and the Manual of Discipline, also known as the Community Rule, which had split into 2. These 4 were in turn sold to the Syrian Metropolitan, Archbishop, Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, head of the Syrian Jacobite Church. Samuel later sent George Isaiah back to Qumran to carry out secret extensive excavations. It is believed that other scrolls were discovered, the contents of which have not been revealed. In September 1947, Samuel took the 4 scrolls to Homs, north of Damascus, Syria, where he met with the patriarch of the church. During his return trip, he again sent a team to Qumran. Samuel got in touch with Professor Eliezer Sukenik of the Hebrew University's Department of Archaeology in order to have the age of the scrolls determined. Meanwhile, in November 1947, Sukenik was contacted by someone identifying himself only as an Armenian antique dealer, and he was able to purchase the other 3 scrolls, which turned out to be the War of the Sons of Light with the Sons of Darkness, also called the War Scroll, the Book of Hymns, also known as the Psalm of Thanksgiving Scroll, and another copy of Isaiah. In January 1948, Sukenik received one of Samuel's scrolls, a copy of the Isaiah scroll, which he was able to inspect. Although he was interested in purchasing the 4 scrolls, he couldn't raise the money necessary to make the transaction. Samuel then contacted the William F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, where the scrolls were inspected by John C. Trevor and William H. Brownlee, who felt they were as old, if not older, than the 2nd century Nash papyrus fragment, which up to then, was the oldest known example of Biblical Hebrew. A set of prints were forwarded to Professor William Foxwell Albright at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, who was the leading Hebrew epigraphist in the world. He dated the material back to 100 BC. Upon examination of all these Hebrew and Aramaic scrolls and fragments which have been discovered at Qumran, it is generally accepted that they were written between 250 BC and 68 AD, when the Romans destroyed the Qumran settlement. The scrolls were taken to a bank in Beirut, and then in January 1949, to a New York City bank vault. Up to 1954, only 3 of the scrolls had been published. Samuel, labeled a smuggler, was anxious to sell the scrolls, and would not allow the 4th to be published until all of them had been purchased. In February 1949, Gerald Lancaster Harding, director of the Department of Antiquities for Transjordan and Arab Palestine, and Father Roland de Vaux, director of the Dominican-controlled École Biblique in the Jordanian sector of East Jerusalem, went to the cave at Qumran, where they found the remains of 30 identifiable texts, and a number of unidentifiable fragments. Harding made it known that he was interested in all subsequent finds made by the Tamare tribe. They would sell the results of their excavation to Kondo, who would then sell the items to Harding. Meanwhile, de Vaux, Harding, and a group of 15 workers continued to excavate around Qumran until 1956, where they uncovered the buildings of what they felt were an Essene community. For nearly 2 weeks in mid-March 1952, de Vaux, 3 members of the École Biblique, William Reed, director of the Albright Institute, and 24 Bedouins under the supervision of 3 Jordanian and Palestinian archaeologists, embarked on an effort to conduct a survey of all the caves in the area. This survey indicated the existence of 40 caves, and the umbrella term of the Dead Sea Scrolls refers to the scrolls and fragments that were found in 11 of the caves. In September 1952, in Cave 4, located about 50 feet away from some of the Qumran ruins, the largest number of scroll fragments were discovered, the remains of over 500 different scrolls. By 1959, all the scroll fragments were kept in a room known as the Scrollery in the Rockefeller Museum. formerly known as the Palestine Archaeological Museum, which had been built with funds provided by John D. Rockefeller. The museum was run by an international board of trustees, and later fell under the control of the Jordanian government. After the Six-Day War in June 1967, when Israel took over control of the entire city of Jerusalem, the contents of the museum were considered spoils of war, so the Israeli government became the guardian of the fragments. The museum contained laboratories, photographic facilities, and the Department of Antiquities. However, the headquarters of the entire operation was actually located at the École Biblique, which contained a research library totally dedicated to Qumran research, which was not open to the public. They also published two journals, the Revue Biblique, printed since 1892, and the Revue de Qumran, started in 1958 to publish information on the scrolls. This may be one of the keys to understanding what may be going on here behind the scenes. In 1882, on the site where, according to tradition, Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was stoned to death, a French Dominican monk established a Dominican church and monastery in Jerusalem. At the urging of Pope Leo XIII, a biblical school was begun there in 1890 by Father Albert Lagrange to train scholars with the knowledge necessary to protect the church against the potential of damaging archaeological discoveries. Originally known as the École Pratique d'études bibliques, it was later renamed the École Biblique et Archéologique Française de Jerusalem. Lagrange became a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which had been started by Pope Leo to monitor the work of Catholic scriptural scholarship. In 1956, de Vaux became a consultant to this commission until his death in 1971, as did his successors Father Pierre Benoit and Jean-Luc Vesco in 1987. The head of the Pontifical Biblical Commission is Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who is also the executive head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which prior to 1965 had been known as the Holy Office, and prior to 1542, as the Holy Inquisition. After 1971, with many common members, the two groups were virtually combined, sharing the same offices at the Palace of the Congregation at the Holy Office Square in Rome. Because of this connection, the implication had been made that the Vatican was exerting influence over the scrolls, in order to control what information is released. The team that de Vaux chose in 1953, to assemble and translate the scrolls were primarily Catholic. 1. Frank Cross, Harvard professor, of the McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago and the Albright Institute in Jerusalem, the only Protestant on the team. 2. Monsignor Patrick Scahan, from the United States, who was director of the Albright Institute. He was quoted as saying that the biblical scholar should adhere to church doctrine and be subject always to the sovereign right of the Holy Mother Church to witness definitively what is in fact concordant with the teaching she has received from Christ. When he died in 1980, he was replaced by Professor Eugene Ulrich of Notre Dame University. 3. Father Jean Starkey, from France, who, after his death, was replaced by Father Emile Puech of the École Biblique. 4. Dr. Klaus Hunzinger, from Germany, who was later replaced by a French priest, Father Maurice Baillet. 5. Father Joseph Malik, a priest from Poland. 6. John M. Allegro, an ex-Methodist turned agnostic from Oxford, who revealed that certain material was being kept secret because of the controversial nature, and de Vaux did not want the church to be embarrassed. He was replaced by Oxford professor John Strugnell, who in 1960 became assistant professor of Old Testament studies at Duke University, and in 1968 became the professor of Christian origins at the Harvard Divinity School. After de Vaux's death in 1971, his hand-picked successor was another Dominican, Father Pierre Benoit, who became the head of the École Biblique and the overseer of the international team, until his death in 1987. Strugnell, who converted to Catholicism, then became the leader of the team. As you can see, this small group of Catholic scholars had complete control of all of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments that were found. In 1954, Yigal Yadin, the former chief of staff for the Israeli Defense Forces, who taught archaeology at Hebrew University, purchased Samuel's 4 scrolls for $250,000. Ironically, he was the son of Professor Sukenik. These 4 scrolls, and the 3 purchased by his father, were then housed in a building known as the Shrine of the Book. While the Israelis worked on these scrolls, across town at the Rockefeller Museum, de Vaux and his group of international scholars were working on the fragments they discovered. In 1967, Yadin interrogated Kondo, who subsequently relinquished possession of a scroll he had for 6 years, which had been found in Cave 11. Known as the Temple Scroll, at 27 feet, it is the longest scroll, and has been dated between 150 to 125 BC. It has references to the building of the temple in Jerusalem, and the rituals to be performed there. However, because of the laws found in it in regard to general matters, and quotes from the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah of Moses, it has been referred to as the 6th book of the law, and may contain the information referred to in 1 Chronicles 28:11-19 and 1 Samuel 8:11. The Pentateuch was compiled by Ezra, Ezra 7:14, about 458 BC, and it is believed that what was edited out became part of the temple scroll. 5 separate sources were compiled to form the temple scroll, and it is now considered a supplement to the Torah. In addition to the content, another reason that it is considered a biblical text is that in all established biblical books, the name of God, YHWH, Yahweh, is written in the square Aramaic script like the rest of the text, while in non-biblical writings, the name is written in Paleo-Hebrew, while the rest of the text is in Aramaic. The goal of DeVox's international team was for the Oxford University Press to publish all Qumran scrolls by 1962 in a series called The Discoveries in the Judean Desert of Jordan. That didn't happen. The first, in 1955, contained the fragments found in the original cave, known as Cave 1. In 1961, the second volume appeared. However, it contained material discovered in the 4 caves of Wadi Murabat, 11 miles south of Qumran, and was dated from 70 to 135 AD. This find included the Hebrew versions of all the minor prophets, including Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. In 1963, the third volume was published, containing fragments from Cave 2, Cave 3, and Caves 5 to 10, including the copper scroll found in Cave 3, and fragments from 2 copies of the Book of Jubilees, a copy of which was later found at Masada. Some researchers believe that the copper scroll should be put in a different category, and separated from the other texts that have been found, because it is the only document that was recorded on metal. It was written in a different variation of Hebrew, and was discovered in an isolated section of the cave, which could indicate a different origin. The fourth volume, in 1965, was a collection of Psalms found in Cave 11. The fifth volume, in 1968, under the direction of Allegro, contained some material from Cave 4. However, most of the scrolls from this cave continued to be withheld from the public, even though Allegro had said in 1964 that the compilation and translation had been nearly completed by 1961. The sixth installment of the series appeared in 1977, the seventh in 1982, and the eighth, which didn't even deal with the texts of Qumran, was released in 1990. These 8 volumes are said to represent only 25% of the information contained in the scrolls, even though Father Benoit had said in December 1985 that everything would be published by 1993. Strugnell would later set a deadline of 1996. Then it was announced that it would be done by 2000. Edmund Wilson, author of the Scrolls of the Dead Sea, said in 1955 that DeVox's team wanted to isolate the sectarian non-biblical scrolls from being connected with Christianity and Judaism, and concentrated only on the biblical literature. In 1956, tired of DeVox's attempts to prevent the scrolls from being linked to Christianity, John Allegro was a guest on a series of 3 radio shows in northern England. The third interview resulted in a New York Times article which said, "The origins of some Christian ritual and doctrines can be seen in the documents of an extremist Jewish sect that existed for more than 100 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. This is the interpretation placed on the fabulous collection of Dead Sea Scrolls by one of an international team of 7 scholars." John Allegro, who said last night in a broadcast that the historical basis of the Lord's Supper and part at least of the Lord's Prayer and the New Testament teaching of Jesus were attributable to the Qumranians. In 1987, he quit, calling the team's delays inexcusable, saying that for years they had been sitting on material which is not only of outstanding importance, but also quite the most religiously sensitive. He died in 1988. Robert Eisenman, a former research fellow at the Albright Institute, who is a professor of Middle East religions and chairman of religious studies at California State University at Long Beach, was denied access to photographs of the scroll fragments by Strugnell. In 1989, he said publicly that during the last 40 years, all of the research on the Dead Sea Scrolls was controlled by a handful of scholars who had revealed only a small portion. He called for access to the scrolls by qualified scholars, and for AMS, accelerator mass spectroscopy, carbon-14 dating to be performed on the documents to verify the dating, which up to that point had been relying on the original, obsolete form of dating, which had been done shortly after their discovery. In April 1989, the Israeli Archaeological Council created a scroll oversight committee to oversee the publication of all Qumran texts, and to make sure the international team completed their assignments. And in July 1989, Amir Drori, director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, a member of that committee, told the Los Angeles Times that if someone does not complete his work on time, we have the right to deliver the scrolls to someone else. After the Israeli government took full possession of Jerusalem in June of 1967, many were surprised that DeVox was allowed to continue in his capacity as the leader of the team of scholars, even though it was a known fact that he was anti-Semitic, which was why he would not allow any Jewish scholars into the project. In the mid-1980s, Strugnell brought in Israeli scholar Elisha Qimron, Talmud scholar Jacob Sussman, Devorah Dimon of Haifa University, and Emmanuel Tov, Shamar Yahu Talmon, Joseph Baumgarten, and Jonas Greenfield, of Baltimore's Hebrew University, to work on some unpublished text. In November 1990, without informing Strugnell, the Israeli government assigned Emmanuel Tov to become the joint editor-in-chief of the project to finish the translation and publication of the scrolls. Then, in December 1990, the New York Times quoted from an October 28, 1990 interview Strugnell had with the Israeli paper Haaretz, where he said that Judaism was a horrible religion, a racist religion, and that Israel was founded on a lie. Megan Broshi, curator of Jerusalem's Shrine of the Book, said, "We've known for 20 years that he was an anti-Semite." On another occasion, he referred to Strugnell's rabid anti-Semitism. These anti-Semitic comments resulted in him being dismissed from the project as editor-in-chief, even though he still controlled his portion of the texts. Tov became chief editor, along with Professor Eugene Ulrich and Emil Puech. In September 1991, Professor Benzion Vicalder, and one of his doctoral students, Martin G. Abug, from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, released their compilation of the Qumran texts, which was published by the Biblical Archaeological Society. In 1988, Strugnell had printed 30 copies of a 52,000-word concordance of words found in the scroll, which had been created by DeVox's team in the 1950s, so it could be used by the team. Vicalder and Abug used a computer to reconstruct these words, and it was purported to be 80% accurate. Later that month, the Huntington Library in San Marino, California revealed that it had a complete set of negatives, from photographs of the original scrolls, which had been given to them in 1987 by Elizabeth Hay Bechtel of the Bechtel Corporation, who had founded the ancient Biblical Manuscript Center in Claremont, California, who also had a copy. They made microfilm copies available to any scholar who requested it. The Hebrew Union College also have a partial set, and the Oxford Center for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies in England has a full set, which had been given to them in May 1991, by the Israeli Oversight Committee. The Qumran texts, written in Hebrew and Aramaic, are believed to have been written between 250 BC and 68 AD. They have been divided into two groups, biblical and non-biblical. About 20% are biblical. Copies of every book in the Hebrew Bible have been found, except for Esther, which, coincidentally, was the only book that didn't mention the name of God. In Cave 4, one of the most complete manuscripts which they have been able to reconstruct, is the first book of Samuel, which was found to contain passages not contained in our Bible, and is being used to fill in some of the narrative gaps. The non-biblical fragments consist of hymns and psalms, biblical commentaries, legal documents, a letter, apocryphal writings, and an inventory of the temple treasure. Of the non-biblical, there are texts referred to as sectarian writings, which were produced by a unique sect of Jews who have been identified as the Essenes. The 7 intact scrolls that were found in Cave 1 were quickly published by Israeli and American scholars, but the fragments collected by DeVox were a different story. Just in Cave 4, there was believed to be well over 15,000 fragments, and perhaps as many as 100,000, from 500 different manuscripts. In all, the find was said to represent about 800 manuscripts. Of the biblical writings, 25 copies of Deuteronomy were found, 18 copies of Isaiah, and 27 copies of the Psalter. Among the non-biblical, 11 copies of the Community Rule, 9 songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, 8 of the Thanksgiving hymn, and 7 of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. Prior to the discovery of the scrolls, the oldest known Old Testament texts were copies which dated back to 1100 AD, yet they were nearly identical. Originally, only the linen surrounding the scrolls were tested with the carbon-14 dating process, which indicated a date around the 2nd century BC and the beginning of the 1st century AD. In 1991, new tests by a Swiss laboratory confirmed these results. A paleographical analysis was done on the script used in writing the texts, which revealed a similarity to styles that were used from 250 to 150 BC, 150 to 30 BC, and 30 BC to 70 AD. Archaeological dating was also done with the help of several hundred coins which were found in the Qumran complex. The earliest structures were built between 130 to 110 BC, then rebuilt and enlarged from 110 to 40 BC. They discovered evidence of an earthquake which had been recorded as occurring in 31 BC, after which they rebuilt the settlement and occupied it until 68 AD when it was destroyed by Vespasian's Roman legions. During the Maccabean period, in the 2nd century BC, there were 3 main Jewish groups: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Essenes were known to be the strict order. Early historians, such as Pliny the Elder, the 1st century Roman writer, Josephus, and Philo, indicated that the Essenes lived in the area between Jericho and Ein Gedi, on the shores of the Dead Sea, which is where the Qumran ruins are located. The Sadducees, whose religious principles differed from the Pharisees, separated from them after the Maccabean revolt, 168 to 164 BC. A document identified as Miksat Masehi Torah, or some rulings pertaining to the Torah, also known as the Habakkuk letter, which was found in Cave 4, contains about 22 religious laws, and appears to be the basis of the Qumran philosophy. Discovered in 1952, its contents weren't revealed until 1984, and it has led some researchers to believe that the Qumran group seceded from the established religious center in Jerusalem, and became the group known as the Essenes. Yet the Essene name is never used. How this break occurred is not really known. According to one theory, when Judea, under Judas Maccabeus, revolted in 165 BC against the Syrian tyrant King Antiochus IV, thus beginning the Hasmonean line of kings with Judas, 165 to 160 BC, his brother Jonathan, 160 to 143 BC, then his brother Simon, 143 to 134 BC, maintained a friendly relationship with Rome, and in 152 BC when Jonathan made himself the high priest, this upset the hardline Jews who chose to follow a man they referred to as the teacher of righteousness, who was of the Zadokite, who were descendants of the priestly line of Aaron. They went to the desert where they could observe the laws of God. A document found at Qumran was an earlier version of the Damascus document, which was discovered, 2 copies, in a Cairo synagogue in 1896. Dated between 80 to 75 BC, a copy was found in Cave 6, and 7 copies in Cave 4. The fragments recovered at Qumran have proven the Cairo text to be incomplete. The text refers to a contingent of Jews that remained faithful to the law. A teacher of righteousness came to them, and led them into Damascus so they could renew their covenant with God. This covenant is referred to in the community rule. It is believed that there was an Essene community in Damascus. In the book of the Acts of the Apostles, Saul was going to Damascus to persecute these early Christians. Another theory says that after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC, when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, the Essenes were formed as a strict order because they believed they were being punished by God for their disobedience. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem after the Maccabean victories, they became disenchanted and went to Qumran. It was believed that the Essenes were a pacifist, monastic order who wanted to separate themselves from the revolutionary-minded zealots, yet some of the evidence seems to indicate otherwise. Originally thought to have been celibate, the graves of 2 women and a child were discovered, plus the community rule contained marriage laws. The Essenes did not engage in animal sacrifice, yet the temple scroll contains instructions for such rituals, and animal bones have been found. Thought to have been peaceful, their scrolls seem to indicate the knowledge of military strategy, and the ruins of a military defense tower and a forge have been excavated. Several manuscripts from Qumran were also found at the Zealot stronghold on Masada, and there has been some researchers who believe that there was a connection between the 2 groups, while de Vaux and his team were trying to distance the scrolls from Judaism and Christianity, saying there were no connections. The texts which were already published seem to indicate otherwise. Either the early Christians were just living at the Qumran community, or the early Christians and the Qumran community were one and the same. Though Essene in nature, the group in Qumran has been compared to the early church which was based in Jerusalem. The Habakkuk commentary said that Qumran's governing body, the council of the community, was in Jerusalem. In fact, it is believed that the scrolls were taken to Qumran from Jerusalem for protection. Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago has theorized that the scrolls were from the library of the Jewish temple, and taken to Qumran, a military installation, during the first Jewish revolt to keep them safe. The vital link for this belief comes from the Copper Scroll, which lists 64 locations of hidden temple treasure. This seems to indicate that perhaps the Qumran settlement was a retreat for the early Christians. But wait, Christians before Christ? This is one of the controversial developments that have emerged from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The New Testament was written in Greek, and Jesus spoke in Aramaic. The Qumran texts are written in Hebrew and sometimes Aramaic, and has been shown to contain information that is echoed in the New Testament. Prior to the discovery of the scrolls, the teachings of Jesus had been considered as original, though influenced by Old Testament teaching. However, the Qumran documents now indicate the existence of a basis for his message. The community rule, which was discovered in Cave 1, has proven to be one of the most important discoveries in Qumran. It is a record of the rules and regulations of the Qumran community, where all must make a covenant before God to obey all his commandments. One of the basic tenets of Christianity, the baptism of purification, is discussed. It says that the convert shall be cleansed from all his sins by the Spirit of holiness uniting him to its truth. And when his flesh is sprinkled with purifying water and sanctified by cleansing water, it shall be made clean by the humble submission of his soul to all the precepts of God. This has led to the theory that John the Baptist had lived at Qumran until he was called by God to be the forerunner of Jesus. Author Charles Francis Potter, in his book The Lost Years of Jesus, attempted to explain the 18 silent years of Jesus, between the ages of 12 and 30, as being spent at Qumran. In the Acts of the Apostles, Acts 2:44-46, it says, "And all that believed were together, and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, as every man had need. And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple. And quote. This shows that common ownership was part of the early Christian philosophy. The community rule stated, all shall bring all their knowledge, powers and possessions into the community, they shall eat in common and pray in common. And his property shall be merged, and he shall offer his counsel and judgment to the community. And quote. Also in Acts, the church leadership is shown to be made up of 12 apostles, which according to Galatians, were led by James, the brother of Jesus, John and Peter. In the community rule, the Qumran group were governed by a council of 12 people, with 3 priests that were in leadership roles, though it is not known if they were part of the 12. It also talks about a meal of the congregation, which is a ritual very much like the Last Supper and the subsequent communion ceremony, while other documents contain parallels with the Sermon on the Mount, and the concept of the battle between the darkness and the light. The Qumran texts contain references to what's been identified as a messianic figure known as the Teacher of Righteousness, which some have tried to identify as being Jesus. However, there are no references as to the divinity of this person, so it couldn't be Jesus. In addition, because of the age of the document, this person would have been living well before the time of Christ. However, recently released fragments do allude to Jesus. An unpublished Aramaic scroll fragment out of Cave 4 mention the Son of God and the Son of the Most High, in a similar manner as Luke 1:32-35. It is the first time these references have appeared in any outside text. Newly released fragments out of Cave 4 even prophesy the coming of Jesus, as the Messiah. Fragment 4Q285 said that a staff shall rise from the root of Jesse, the branch of David, and they will put to death the leader of the community. And quote. Fragment 4Q521 said, the heavens and the earth will obey his Messiah. He will not turn aside from the commandments of the holy ones. For the Lord will visit the pious ones, and the righteous will call by name. He shall release the captives, make the blind to see, raise up the downtrodden. He will heal the sick, resurrect the dead, and to the meek announce glad tidings. And quote. Much has been made about this small group of men, who for 40 years had been silent about the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls which were in their possession, with some being considered as emissaries of the Catholic Church. Was it because the scrolls are contrary to the Bible in respect to the origin of Christianity, or was it, as some maintain, because of the power it gave them? Or, as Randall Price maintains, in his book Secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is all of this talk just an effort to prevent serious consideration of the scrolls as verification and corroboration of the Bible? Price quotes Professor Tove, who said, I would completely brush aside any accusations of suppressed material. There is no evidence whatsoever for this having been done by any Catholic source. And quote. He also quotes Joseph A. Fitzmyer, a Catholic scholar, and member of the scroll team, who said, the whole idea of a Vatican conspiracy to suppress the scrolls that the book The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Bajan and Lee, portrays is ludicrous nonsense. And quote. Randall Price then proceeds to completely unravel the whole conspiratorial argument behind the delays as being because of the condition of the texts, accessibility of the materials, the political situation, the nature of the text assignments, scholastic responsibilities, financial problems, and human problems. And quote. His argument is just as convincing. My concern is that, where there is smoke, there may also be fire. Any kind of association with the Rockefeller name brings with it the influence of the ecumenical movement, and any kind of connection to Catholicism brings with it the baggage of their pagan origins. See my online book Controlled by the Calendar. Many eminent scholars have tried to make a connection between the scrolls and the Essenes, even when the evidence for this is circumstantial at best. As I will discuss in the next chapter, those who have tried to prove that Jesus faked his crucifixion have also tried to link him with the Essenes. Even though the scrolls themselves indicate that the inhabitants of Qumran engaged in the study of astrology and mysticism, this group has been identified as the starting point for the philosophy which became Christianity. So, if we are to believe some of the interpretations of the scrolls, that the teachings of Jesus were based on the philosophy of the Essenes, this seriously damages his image as being the father of a religion that bears his name. Not only that, but it further diminishes his divinity, which has increasingly come under attack. When the last remnants of the scrolls are published, those discovered so far, and those yet to be discovered, some scholars have expressed a wish for new versions of the Bible to reflect the new information gleaned from the scrolls. If this happens, will the new material be used to buttress the scriptures as being Holy Spirit inspired, or will they take on the spin of a pre-Christ Christianity, and further contribute to the taking of Christ out of the Christianity of mainline churches, so that the role of Jesus is reduced to that of just a teacher or a political visionary? Since I believe that Jesus taught only what was given unto him through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, what legitimacy should be given to the Dead Sea Scrolls, if any? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, they are legitimate documents, and not the result of an incredible forgery, as far as being done shortly before their discovery. Therefore, we have to look in another direction. Now that other scholars have access to them, I would think that any incorrect translations would be revised, which brings us to the reconstruction of the actual fragments themselves. We have been forced to rely on the accuracy of de Vaux's team, and their ability to fit the quagmire of pieces together into some sort of coherency. It would seem that gaps in the assembled fragments of text, especially in the case of the Essene documents, would make it difficult to actually grasp its full meaning, especially since missing words may have a bearing on how other words are translated. The complex techniques utilized in this process have brought very little criticism in regard to its accuracy. Another point of contention is the procedure used to date the scrolls. Carbon-14 dating has long been criticized as being inaccurate. Originally only the wrapping around them were tested, because they didn't want to destroy any text in order to date them. However, new techniques need less material to achieve the same results. But remember, what is being dated is the material that was written on. If a fragment was dated back to 200 BC, there is no way of knowing whether it was actually written on at that time, or maybe 300 years later. This knowledge makes it difficult to assume the accuracy of any dating. We must also take into account whether or not a document is describing actual events, or if it is just plain fiction. For example, it is commonly accepted that some apocryphal books such as Tobit and Bel and the Dragon were works of fiction, and for that reason were not included in the Bible. Many apocryphal writings were found at Qumran. When it comes to analyzing the contents of a text, how do you decide that it is a historically accurate document, if you don't know the intention of the writer, or even who the writer was? Just as the writers of the Gospels have been accused of embellishment, do some of the Qumran texts contain embellishments? Because of the initial secrecy surrounding the scrolls, how will we really know that all of the fragments found will be released? It was said that some fragments had been taken to the École Biblique. Were they ever returned to the Rockefeller Museum? I guess, what I am thinking here, is that if they had discovered something that would have shaken the very foundation of the Christian church, would the scroll team have allowed it to remain, or would it have found its way into the dark recesses of the Vatican, never again to see the light of day, or perhaps only locked away for a short time, to be released when the time is right? As Price maintains, there may very well be nothing to the negative slant that has been applied to the scrolls, and yet, it is very hard not to think conspiratorially because of all the circumstances surrounding them. I believe that the scrolls are part of the last days trigger, and as such, I believe that they are going to be used in some way to perpetuate an end-time deception. In addition, how about the existence of other scrolls which haven't made their way into official hands so they can scrutinized by scholars? Strugnell revealed the existence of 4 other scrolls from Cave 11. Of the 2 he saw, one was a complete copy of the Book of Enoch. On his deathbed, Lancaster Harding, the director of Jordan's Department of Antiquities, claimed to have seen 2 more scrolls that Strugnell had not seen. All 4 are located in Jordan. Stories have also circulated about Bedouin discoveries which were not given to de Vaux, and have yet to surface. Plus there have been other optimistic forays into the area which could eventually turn up more scrolls or fragments. In one case, archaeologists Dr. Gary Collett and Dr. Aubrey L. Richardson, using sophisticated equipment developed by NASA, which can sense non-visible elements of the electromagnetic spectrum and interpret the type of molecules found in its makeup, claimed that there were still unexplored caves, including one which may contain up to 40 intact jars, of the kind used to store manuscripts, and evidence of another copper scroll. A dig was initiated, sanctioned by the Israeli government, to reach this cave, which had not turned up anything. My feeling is that there hasn't been enough substantiation from the scrolls to make the kind of claims that have been made. For example, various books in the Bible contain the same information, and are used to cross-reference each other, and that wasn't possible with the scrolls. So, because of that, should their scholarship be accepted, especially when some of the rituals that are similar to the early Christian church may be nothing more than natural progression or theological evolution? Because of further archaeological excavation, we may continue to get a steady flow of information from Qumran for years to come, and how it will affect the perception of Christianity is yet to be seen. All we can do is to evaluate what is available now, and how some of the questionable texts may be used to manipulate religion in this country. It would be nice to know how much influence the Rockefeller family has on the Rockefeller Museum, where all the fragments were housed. Believe the fact that they have not lent their name, or given money to anything they haven't been able to influence. Their name also figures prominently in the talk concerning the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. Knowing that they have a huge role in establishing the New World Order, their involvement in the various affairs of Israel has ominous overtones.